Daniel Kurganov. I'm the director here at TONEBASE Live Violin. And I'm very excited today. We have a very, very special guest, Julia Glenn. Julia is a violinist who plays in the Lydian Quartet and is a faculty member at Brandeis University. And she also taught at Juilliard in Tianjin for a number of years. And today she's going to guide us through some of her observations and methods regarding music theory and how we can implement it into our performances to enrich them. And yeah, so welcome, Julia. Very glad.
谢谢大家好，我叫 Julia。Daniel 刚说的，今天非常荣幸有机会跟你们讲一些就是我特别感兴趣的题目话题啊，包括这个音乐理论与表演的关系啊。
Now, be honest, you just memorized that for today, right?
I was talking about cheese, actually, different varieties and the importance of cheese in your life.
Cheese is a drug.
Cheese is, and it's, I'm okay with that. I'm really,
That's good.
Yeah. No, but what I really said was how excited and honored I am to be here today to explore a little bit, dive into this topic of, so-called music theory and kind of the separation that is usually made between theory and performance and how we can benefit from a really performative theoretical approach and just kind of my own thinking with these topics.
Great. So I'll ask you a question just off the bat, and something I'm always curious about with people who are as passionate about teaching as you are. When you're trying to teach a specific musical effect, what do you reach for first? Explanation or demonstration? And a follow-up to that, is that a conscious choice, or is it just kind of your nature to go towards one or the other first?
It's a really good question. I think my first instinct is to go towards the student's ear and aural imagination, right? What are you imagining? What are you hearing in relation to what came before, what you're expecting or not expecting to come next? I find that, inception rarely works. Any idea has to come from you. And so I can, talk and talk, but really if I'm not connecting it to something that you're generating, that you're initiating.
So you're neither explaining nor demonstrating in a way. You're trying to have the student discover and come upon this idea from like hints or kind of a push in the right direction?
Yeah, push in the right direction. I think hybrid approach is definitely the way to go. And if I can imagine a sound and demonstrate that and then kind of accompany it or augment it with some explanation, then I'll do that. But I think doing only one can be limiting depending on the student.
And what about when certain ideas, like I find this in my own teaching, certain musical ideas that are natural to me or even obvious to me for whatever reasons are so foreign to a student. There's this kind of range that I always like to classify, like something that's obvious, something that's novel but imaginable, and then something that's unimaginable, something that like, breaks a certain wall where like you would never have thought of that thing, and it's just a little bit foreign. So yeah, when you reach that point where it's a foreign idea to someone, how do you, like, what's your approach to kind of make it more intuitively felt by a student? Like, there's certain things I imagine that it's hard to get the student to arrive at on their own, just because it's maybe something very particular or sophisticated and they don't have certain tools. Like, yeah, I don't know. Do you ever come across that? Like people are just...
another really good question. And my first instinct is always to ask, okay, first of all, was it intentional? And second of all, what are you thinking? Describe to me your thinking. Describe to me how you got to this process. Because usually if we do something that doesn't make sense to somebody else, it's because we weren't completely thinking it through, or because it makes sense to us and we haven't communicated how or why. And I love, hearing things in new ways. And on occasion, there will be an interpretation that really is deliberate and I really don't quite agree with it. But I think a great reaction is just assume it's a good idea and live with it for a little while, and then you might have new interpretations yourself. If it is not a deliberate, or intuitive interpretation, then I tend to back up in the phrase or back up in the gesture or back up even in the chord and explain how, okay, this is how I'm feeling it, and these are the avenues of opportunities this particular set of choices opens up. Perhaps yours is not one of them that makes the most sense, but
it's probably not. I can guarantee it.
But I'm always in favor of people going for something that might be a really different interpretation than what I like. I remember a good friend, placed, I don't know, third or something in a competition or didn't make the finals or whatever. And the jurors wrote in the comments, oh, the third movement of your Tchaikovsky concerto, it sounded like a circus. And she read those and she said, yes, that's exactly what I want it to sound like.
Yeah.
So.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, there's a range.
And so, getting to the topic of music theory more directly, where do you think that disconnect comes from of, music theory, which has to be, by definition, something so intertwined and related to the music and what it's expressing, and, there should be a natural connection there, yet it's so often disconnected. Where do you think that comes from?
A big topic. I think we started to see more divergence in the 18th century, the big hotbed for treatises, and when we started to see the big shift from the use of figured bass and counterpoint to eventually the use of Roman numerals, which we saw more in the 19th century. But once it started to get really, intellectual and not coming from practice, that possibility for separation also grew.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned figured bass. Like, keyboard players were technically great theoreticians by necessity.
Right.
Because you see figured bass and you have to know, it's just, so there's a direct line from theory to practice.
Yeah, exactly. And it's the separation is not entirely bad because it lets us, reach more specialized areas and communicate in ways that we weren't able to before. But sometimes, especially in music schools, which is funny, I mean, performance schools, sometimes the way that music theory is taught is a little bit too divorced from practice, in my opinion. So kind of more emphasis on vertical elements rather than process-based, unfrozen. I mean, even if we're just hearing a chord, it's moving in time, or we're hearing backwards in time, relating it to something else, right? It's impossible
it's not in isolation.
to hear. Yeah, it's impossible to exist with time in isolation.
Yeah, once you start relating anything to what came before and what comes after, you necessarily have to call these patterns and ways of thinking something, and that is would be music theory.
Yeah. So the way that I teach music theory, it's always very connected to performance, and the aim is that you can be a better performer whether you play an instrument or not. Sometimes it's just how you hear the music in your head, right? Because you're, in a way, that's performing it, how you're putting it together, your mental map. And so I like to combine a lot of different tools, drawing from these different rich traditions. I don't only use Roman numerals. I don't only use figured bass. I don't only use kind of Schenkerian type symbols.
Squiggles?
I use a lot of, kind of funny bunny squiggles. And today I prepared a little bit of kind of just quick notating of a couple scores to see how flexible of a tool this can be, depending on your needs and your interests and your background.
Yeah, and I'm always left thinking, how is music theory being taught in schools, and is it maybe being taught very poorly, or I remember from my undergrad, I got the sensation that music comes from theory, that here are all these patterns and rules, and the music comes from that. where, and later I realized, no, there was great music and somebody was analyzing it essentially and derived rules.
Well, I think it's really
it's like
bi-directional. Yeah, chicken and egg, and they're both really feeding and helping each other. And I also am not in any way bashing all music theory teachers because
just some of them.
Well, there's just that possibility that's because of the system that we've built, right?
Sure.
Because of our tradition.
It's just like what in my music theory class, like, yeah, we analyzed some pieces, but it wasn't like, listen to this effect, feel this effect. Like, before we get into anything about the nitty gritty of Roman numerals, of figured bass, of, augmented chords, like, feel this. Here's an explanation of what you're feeling and why you might be feeling that.
Yeah, and actually my own approach to theory, a little bit similar to some aspects of my approach to violin, and I think your approach to violin, in that I came to formal theory training a little bit later. I was always going to...
Did you do Suzuki as a kid?
I didn't do Suzuki.
No. Okay.
A couple of things from Suzuki, but I didn't do the full Suzuki method. But, I had perfect pitch and have perfect pitch, and so I sort of relied on that and whatever tools I was getting. But really delving into kind of more theoretical background, I didn't do that until I was doing my doctorate at Juilliard. So I was kind of approaching it from a very different way. And then also at that time, I started Baroque violin.
Yes.
And using different tunings, different A's. And so my sense of, music theory being guided by absolute pitch out the window, which was a beautiful thing to have happen.
Yeah, well, that's fascinating. And speaking of pitch and perfect and non-perfect, I want to dig in a little bit to your background in Chinese music and the time you spent in China and teaching at Juilliard there. Could you maybe, just for people that aren't very familiar with Chinese traditional music, kind of describe the main aspects of kind of also how it relates to Western classical music and what sort of things you learned, studying Chinese music, what insight that gave you into Western music, potentially, just because there's so much, this is like a big point of yours about like the Chinese language, like sounds and, the way things are pronounced in Mandarin and how that relates to the music that's composed. Surely that's something that, maybe is less intimately, probably, because like Bach was operating on a different level. So I'm just curious about that experience, if you can talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I first started becoming interested in this when I was studying Chinese as an undergrad, and I kind of noticed two groups of students, and one group learned to speak and listen really well, and one group was much better at reading and writing. And the former group, almost everybody had some musical background or like a little bit of musical training. So, then I was a linguistics major, phonology major, and so I sort of did a little bit of work looking into that more, and then just kept going back to China, meeting more composers, meeting more Chinese-speaking musicians, and I really started to notice, wow, there's something fascinating here in terms of the perception. So really the past, 10 years or so, I've been exploring more and more works written by living Chinese-speaking composers. I'm hesitant to use the label Chinese music. I'm hesitant to use the label contemporary Chinese music. It's because it's so varied.
Yes.
But one of the things that describes this music is the possibility that's there for musical and linguistic interaction. And it's something, as native speakers of a non-tonal language, that we don't really consider as much. But if we do, then we can change our own perception, we can change our own approach to how we play, to how we hear, to how we categorize things, how we perceive, really. So that's the overall interest driving it.
So do you think it's possible, like that sort of connection between Chinese language, Chinese music, and what that offers, is it possible to make those connections in Western music with, Western languages, or do the languages inherently not offer those
work and exploration and just physically how all of our speech organs work together and how to mimic that and kind of play around in the sandbox with that a little bit.
What about retroactively? Like, can you take old music and notice certain patterns there that mirror language in a way that wasn't like overtly expressed, but it is just inherently there, the way it maybe is more overt in Chinese music. Like in Indian music, things are more codified. Things that in Western music are very like niche or don't have terms around it, like it's actually codified in Indian classical, like how you travel between notes and all these things that like we have to talk about fish and rainbows and the violin play, like to get across some ideas. They have it codified.
Wow. Okay.
And I think in Chinese music probably some similarities to that. So yeah, I'm wondering if that same kind of way of codifying it could be translated to Western music.
I think perhaps not as overtly, but there has been some interesting work done, for instance, looking at what's called the NPVI, Normalized Pairwise Variability Index, I believe.
One more time?
Normalized Pairwise Variability Index, I believe. NPVI, which is usually used to measure rhythm in speech. And it's been applied to the music of different cultures before and after the rise of nationalism. And looking at, okay, so after kind of the domination of Italian influence, did things kind of go back closer to an NPVI, closer to their language that they speak? And yeah, so some work like that has been done. And the overall conclusion is yes. Although it's difficult because our notation, even though it's a great accomplishment of Western civilization, our notation is quite limited, as you know. Yes. Right? So there's a lot in there that if we're just looking at the notation, we're missing.
Yeah, well, I mean, getting into what we're going to look at today, like the notation of Bach, it's always so fascinating. Like looking at his scores, if you see his handwriting, it feels like he wants to get out of the limitations. Like it's so beautiful.
I think so many composers do.
Yeah, especially Beethoven. Not always in a good way. But like Bach's hand is so beautiful, and there's so much to gain from looking at the way it's written, like in the adagio, like the way that the stems are connected and how he draws. It almost follows the phrase sometimes.
I'm so happy you said that. I completely agree. And even the gestures of the slurs, right? It's closer in a way to calligraphy, where there's motion inherent in the calligraphy. It's not static. Yeah. So, yeah, I like looking at that also for Paganini caprices.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's really fun.
Yeah, that's a very cool manuscript.
The dancing manuscript, yeah.
So maybe describe a little bit of what we're going to go through today. By the way, the scores for these activities are going to be in the chat, and encourage you all to follow along in the chat and interact, and you can ask questions. We'll have time for that at the end. For those of you watching on YouTube, I do encourage you to watch on TONEBASE. I left a link there, and that way you'll be able to interact with us. I can't unfortunately check the YouTube chat and the TONEBASE chat, otherwise I'll go crazy. So
you're already crazy.
I am crazy. I don't want to get more crazy.
Me
otherwise
too.
We'll all be in the paper tomorrow. So so why don't we get started, and I'm curious what you have planned for us.
Sure. Well, I prepared a couple of scores, one that's a little bit faster and everybody's probably more familiar with, and one that's a little bit slower and fewer people are familiar with. So we can start with the Presto from Bach's G minor sonata. And I think you'll see it coming up. Are we going to screen share? There we go. Amazing. So I kind of just did some squiggledy wiggledies to demonstrate, and we can go through it, and we can try things together. I'd love to bounce things off of you and see your reactions to the notations. But just to give a very introductory preview to the types of things I think about in my own playing and in my own teaching. So this movement, right, when we first see it, it's a little bit daunting because where are the dynamics and where is the rhythmic variation? It's all 16th notes, right? So how do we know where to start?
It's such a common problem too. People see 16th notes and like, it's just, okay, let me just try to play this and stop there.
Yes, I'll try to play it and rhythmically perfect, metronomic. We'll figure everything out later as we go.
Yeah. Never get there though.
So one really nice place to start is just with contour. And what I mean by that is the direction and the size of the intervals locally and then more broadly speaking. So right at the start, we see that, it's essentially, it's just a simple G minor arpeggio, but that simple G minor arpeggio, that's so effective, right? And even the way that we practice arpeggios and scales can transform how we're approaching music, yeah? Like if I play a simple, right? It's just a simple 1-octave scale, but that has everything. It has universes inside of it. And the same thing with arpeggios. So if we sensitize ourselves to those contours, that's going to open up a lot of doors. Now you'll see this first line here, I've written many dotted kind of phrasing slurs and some in parentheses. And then starting in measure 4, you'll see that I've written these funny orange ticks. And this is kind of bringing out the counterpoint that I want to highlight for my own mind. So after we have this opening, so I want to bring out, I want to bring those intervals out. The other thing I'll suggest is that a movement like this, it's wonderful to take the bowing and take the rhythm out of it and kind of just mess around with it a little bit more. So I'll demonstrate a little bit of what that might sound like. Ooh, that's interesting. I want to do it again. And now you'll see here that I've written in measure 12 these I could keep going, right? Because what do we have here? Many different ways to label this. The label doesn't matter, but this is a sequence, right? And if we look at kind of the units of the strong beat, weak beat, strong, weak, you'll notice that the strong beat is going. So that's why I've called it a D2. It means descending second for the strong beat, the root of the sequence.
Question.
Yeah.
How do you approach some students have an idea of like the bass line and the importance of the bass line. One thing I find when people are on that journey of, sensitizing themselves, they sometimes stop at the bass line. It's like, and what I noticed from what you're doing, you're not always prioritizing the bass. Very often you're prioritizing certain gestures and slurs in the upper voices. And so I'm wondering, what's your process of kind of prioritizing in that regard? Like what, like during that exploration you just did, it's something I noticed. You're adjusting your priorities.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking not in the typical sense of root, but rather sounding bass and how that is generating things. And so the melody on the top and the counterpoint between the outer voices, that's coming from the bass kind of melody, but it's not a standalone thing. So maybe that's why that relationship is there.
It seems like also it's related to a sensitivity to dissonance.
Yes.
And resolution. Like
yes. Exactly. Look at my little 4/3 I've written. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Right. And this comes from figured bass traditions.
4/3. Those aren't fingerings, are
No, they're not fingerings. That's showing a suspension because it's. That's the harmony, right? But then. That's what it is. Yeah, so it's a unit. It's coming from the bass. It can't be isolated.
Yeah, I love suspensions.
Oh, me too. I'm a sucker for, and 4/3 is my favorite.
4/3.
That's how to get me. I am a sucker for 4/3 suspensions. I think that's one of the big reasons I love French Baroque music so much.
I think my favorite.
Oh, that's a good one too.
The 2/1 or what do they call this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I interrupted.
Oh no, not at all. So should we keep going with this?
Yeah.
Okay. So continuing with that kind of exploratory mindset, I think we got up to the D2, and then this is a surprise because, and you'll notice measure 17, I've written here. Yeah, it's kind of the weak beat, but it's also an elision because it's the start of a new phrase. And by the way, if anybody...
Explain what an elision is to those that
a bridge. It's the ending of something and it's the beginning of something else. So it's not really a period and it's not really a capital letter. It's something in between. And by the way, these symbols, the kind of... Here, I can draw them again with the pen. If you see them, this and that comes from prosody and, to show us the stress points. So the strong and the weak. Chiaro oscuro, very important in Baroque music especially, but everything, right? Light and shadow. And
in art in general.
Yes, absolutely. So it's just showing, for instance, if you looked at my name, Julia, right? Instead of Julia or Julia.
Is that how you introduce yourself? Always mine?
I am Julia. Yes, I play the violin.
Good.
Anyway, so that's what those little symbols mean. And that gives me a sense of, because I know it's a sequence, it's less. More, less. Yeah. And I could turn it on its head. There's no reason I have to do that. I could do... Yeah, something like that. Right?
Back, like turning it on its
Sure.
head.
Yeah, anyway, lots of options, but it opens up more ideas because we're thinking that way.
Love it.
Okay, and now this surprise. And look at measure 17. Now, you don't need to have a Roman numeral for this chord or a label or anything, but we know that's surprising. That's shocking. It's earth-shattering. And that's a moment where you can just pay attention to your physical response. How do your eyebrows move? How do your forehead muscles move? What happens?
We're getting into Benjamin Zander territory.
Oh, lovely. He was my introduction to China, actually.
Really?
That was the first time I went to China was with his youth orchestra.
How lovely.
It was amazing. It was life-changing. I loved it. It was good. Okay, but the other important thing about measure 17, look at this. Okay? Now, if we're thinking in terms of roots, which Bach probably would not like so much, right? It's just an E flat major chord. Now, if we start that on a G, it's a little less stable, okay? If we start it on a B flat, ooh, that's a 6/4 chord, meaning there's a sixth above the bass and a fourth above the bass. That is really unstable. 6/4 chords are very, very unstable. So there's something about that where you're just like, you're on the edge of your seat and you have to keep going. By the way, another sequence here. Now it's an ascending second. If we zoom out, we can see that every 2 measures, it's going up by a second. Yeah, so there's some relation there. Next one. And by the way, that's like our first really settled kind of cadence, yeah? And I called it a local structural predominant, dominant, tonic. That's what these symbols mean, PD, D, and T.
Is it a little bit of a false cadence? Because it's like...
Exactly. And that's why I wrote in capital letters JK exclamation point.
This is a part of the Schenkerian tradition, right? JK exclamation
Yeah, JK, the exclamation point, otherwise it's not authentic. So yeah, but you're totally right. So you can kind of surprise yourself, and there's a little hint in that it's a da instead of, if it were a 5-1, scale degrees, then that feels a little bit more settled. But if it's 2-1, that's a hint that something is not quite right. Oh no, we're back to minor. And now here I've written exactly what you need. This is in the background. Yes, that. What is that from that Disney movie where the guy's like doing the crazy? You know what I'm talking about?
The Disney movie?
There's a Disney movie with a guy doing exactly what you're doing on a guitar.
There's Robbie Lakatosh doing this kind of stuff.
I'll have to find it for you. But that motion is needed because look at measure 47. This is where we have a pedal structural dominant, right? Local structural dominant. Where does that have to go? Eventually, it has to go here. And so when that starts, we're getting really excited because we know that the foot has lifted and the foot will fall to take us to the close of this opening section. Okay, and now we've arrived at this beautiful D major surprise Picardy D major chord. And that's why I put the little heart here, by the way. It's tonic with a heart. But we know it's not tonic, right? It's not clearly it's not home. Whatever label you want to call it or not call it, it's not home. And it has the potential to continue, or it has the potential to revert back to being dominant.
5 of 5, right?
Exactly.
Takes us back
exactly.
To G minor,
so we could. It could take us right back to the beginning, which it does because there's a repeat sign.
Yeah.
But you can even, you can interpret it lots of different ways for how you're going to go on to the second half. And so you'll see sometimes I do this sort of melodic fluency type tool. For instance, measure 43, where I have these stems going down, and it doesn't matter really the direction, but you can kind of bring out any underlying scales that you want to bring out. Etc., etc. I love to do this in my music because it reminds me of the bones, the scale bone, right? And that can kind of help guide the color and the phrasing and all of that.
No, it's fine.
It's okay, I can use my finger. So, okay.
How do you feel about repeats in Bach?
Oh, I love them because if your mind is open to this, then there are probably a trillion different ways to play it. So you have to try it at least 2 ways. And in the practice room, find many, many, many ideas. Play it with a friend because you can bounce ideas off of each other. You'll come up with more ideas together than you would individually. And ultimately, you can cull probably 80 to 90% of those ideas. And what you're left with are really creative and fulfilling options.
I feel like Bach's repeats are more successful than like Mozart, for example. Every time I do a repeat in Bach, it just feels right. Like, let me do something different and wake people up.
Absolutely. It feels like you're missing half of an arm.
Sometimes with Mozart, I don't know. I don't feel it as much. But maybe that's just...
Well, I think it depends.
Some of the sonatas.
Depends on the piece, and it depends on if you're I don't know, adding any ornamentation or like, different bow things or something like that. But the way that usually we play Mozart on like modern violin with modern piano, the repeats don't make as much sense to me either.
Well, the E minor sonata, wrong key, I'm sure. Like that first repeat, for example, it's something I've been playing a lot lately. Like, I don't know, I mean the second repeat of that.
Ah.
It's like I just don't want to go back to that.
Yeah.
It just doesn't. And there's sonatas like that where it's just like go back. Whereas here it's such an organic turn.
Yes. Yeah.
But
well, I think also with binary form it tends to
right.
be more sensical. But I think it might be a case of like, oh, it's kind of a tradition that was just carried over and over and over. And
well, it forces you to think of how to craft endings and beginnings of things.
Yes.
There maybe is a way to make that gel if you know, like so maybe I'm curious, how would you end this first section the first time, and how would you end it the second time?
I would do it differently every performance. But as an example, let's see. How would you launch back into G minor? I would probably want more tension on the D major. Versus if this is more,
because it's functioning as a dominant if you go back.
Yes.
And then, but if you go forward, it's not. You're already at home.
Right.
The new home base.
Yeah. Or if you wanted to try something funky, you know, you could do last and then a little bit of bow acceleration, slight crescendo. Yeah, that's a little wild, but why not, right? So.
And then I heard you adding some C sharps into there, some little melismatic.
Yeah, or you could add a little. I mean, I'm just messing around, but that's that's sort of what
you have to do.
Yeah.
Cool.
So anyway, this is sort of the basic approach, and you can see similar things. How are we doing for time?
Yeah, we're good. If you want to do the second part or go on to.
Sure. Well, I want to make sure we save a little time for Telemann.
Sure.
But maybe what I'll do is point out something kind of interesting about the ending of the second section. So we heard, and with your beautiful crazed guitar plucking demonstration at 47, that we've got this really big pedal dominant at the end of the first half. The second half, we're kind of left hanging. And you'll see lots of sequences. I mean, this whole movement is just filled with sequences. It's descending second and ascending second all over the place. That's so much of it. So that is an important guiding factor. So maybe I'll go from, we were just talking about this cadence here in 31. There's a spot that's recalling it in our memories, which is in 83. But this is the flip side, right? Because we think we're cadencing in minor. And notice this is, JK, ooh, and I wrote here, 83, ooh. Yeah, a lot of JKs. That's what he's doing, playing with expectations.
Yep.
And it's a 6/3, meaning a 6 over the bass and a third over the bass. Okay, so interesting color. Uh-oh. Oh no. So that's yay. That's uh-oh. Oh no. All of that is A2, ascending second, D2, and lawnmower. And you can decide which notes, which lines you want to bring out.
So many lines.
So many, yeah. And
what would Glenn Gould do?
What would Glenn Gould do? That's a great question.
You'd find a new one.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. I have a question though. Like, one of the problems I have with music theory TM is that it sometimes makes too much of the fact that there's like a chord and then there's another chord, and the cadential 6/4 is an example of putting that on top of its head. Like, is it a 1? Is it a 5? And like, so there's such a gray area. So
yeah,
like when you went to the F major, I see that as like a big prep for B flat.
Absolutely.
In a way.
Yes.
And it's not an F, right? It's an A in the bottom.
Which, by the way, comes from the scale.
Yeah. Right,
yeah,
exactly.
So the way you practice scales can change your life. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, but just this idea that there are these like separate chords, but one chord might actually be a tool, like just a harmonic intervallic tool to get you, because of the way it's voiced, to get you to another chord. So it's like, are there chords or are there just suspensions? Or both?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people have pointed out that chords we think of being as being inherently dissonant or like needing to resolve somewhere. It's kind of in our heads, because it only needs to resolve somewhere if it's come from somewhere specific.
Yeah.
Yeah, and something could have enharmonic equivalence, or it could be in an atonal context, or it could be in non-Western music, and then what's going to happen, right?
Well, it's like the priority of function
Yeah.
over, let's say, maybe just like categorization, taxonomy.
Right. And function really is contextual, and function is living, breathing, going through time. So it can only happen if you've had something come before and have something after.
I have to apologize. There's a lawnmower outside, and I'm not sure what pitch it's centered around. It's probably
sort of like
some
it's like
kind
from
of
an F
B.
sharp to a B.
Yeah, it's probably the harmonic series is in there somewhere.
It's one of my great pet peeves in life, and they knew I was coming, so they arranged specially to mow the entire lawn.
So does it bother you because it's noise, or is it bothering you because it's a certain pitch that you'd prefer to like center this around?
It bothers me that it's a certain pitch that fluctuates, and I'm often trying to work on intonation, with my headphones and my metal mute and my drone, and it's
You wish they would just keep it.
Why? Well, it might kill me one day, so it's a serious, it's.
See, this is the joy of having relative pitch. I have no such problems.
Okay, so the part that we just got to in 95, after this ascending second again. Okay, this is a change. Now, I wrote in 101, smells like, which is kind of a funny thing to write, I realize, but, right, it sounds like, yeah, it seems like there might be sort of a pedal,
Pedal-ish.
Yeah, pedal-ish dominant.
Also, it's jazzy. Da-da-da-da-da.
Yes.
Da-da-da-da-da-da.
Totally playing with the 3 and the 2. But we don't get it. It's thwarted. Okay, now a little. And again, I've outlined the descending scale here. I've taken the liberty of adding, since it's a 6/3 chord, I'm adding a third below the sounding bass. So it's just sol, fa, mi, re, do, si. But then look at measure 111. Ah! There's no bass anymore. What happened? We wanted to go right somehow, that a melodic expectation, and that's totally the carpet is pulled out from beneath us. Okay. Sequence of applied chords. So this is going. Yeah, so a little bit more. Resolution. More. Resolution. 6/3 again. We have no root position. Should be that, but no. Again, gosh dang it.
Next
Can we just
higher gears.
Seriously, let's either get a dominant or a tonic. Come on, people. And then this augmented second, I wrote woof because it's an augmented second. Again, 6/3. Now finally we get that 5/1, right? The quintessential dominant tonic motion at the end. But the end of this has so many more thwarted expectations, unrealized expectations, than I think the ending of the first half. And that's what gives it its truly driving, almost frenetic nature, just sort of like endless exploring, which really influences how you can phrase it.
I like this part. Like the way you described it is, following the chord changes, but if you just take it by how it's voiced monophonically, it's like very strange. And it's almost impossible to get away from that fact that he's like, there are these almost like parallel fifths that are, unless you stress the fact that it's a chord change. So I think he knew that he was playing with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I find that often comes up in Bach, that there are these perversions that are actually fundamentally like harmonically based.
Right.
But because it's a monophonic instrument, it also gives this like spicy flavor to it that isn't like just chord change.
Yeah,
chord change.
You're completely. I completely agree. I love that you're saying that, and that's one of the big kind of takeaway points that I wrote at the bottom of the score is, building, realizing or not realizing, thwarting expectations.
Yeah.
That's kind of the joy of existence, and you can think about it in big terms, in terms of like, okay, what is sonata form, right? It's expectations. Ooh, thwarting expectations, realizing expectations. Home, away from home, home. Or even you could argue tonic, dominant, tonic. So that's in very general, fundamental ways. But it works everywhere in music in terms of the rhythms we hear that prime us to expect certain things, or the melodies that prime us for certain things, and the harmonies, and how we can recognize that and craft a really nuanced and constantly satisfying approach, right? If you think like this, you can practice any given, well-written piece of music for the rest of your life, and you'll never stop having fun. You'll never stop being hungry, right? Like my cat, she's always hungry. Not for Bach, but we can maintain, well, yeah, that's true. Maybe I'm just misinterpreting, but we can maintain this perspective through this approach.
Yeah.
And then
it's infinitely renewable music.
Yes, exactly. So that's why, you notice how I'm staying away from saying, play this like this, right? Or this must be like that. There are snapshots and anytime you're doing a recording, you're making certain choices. But again, they're snapshots and they're options. They're not the answer.
What's your favorite recording of the sonatas and partitas? If you had to choose one.
Only one?
Today.
Only
Caveat
one?
that it can change.
Only one?
Well, okay, give me one and then you can give me a couple more.
Well, I mean, I love Rachel Podder's recording, of course. That's beautiful, beautiful interpretation. There's so many. Oh my gosh. Can I give a couple more?
Yeah.
Okay. I love Monica Huggett's. I love Christian Tetzlaff's. There aren't really any that I don't love, even if I disagree with them.
It's hard to destroy this music.
Yeah.
It's much harder than Chopin. Like, you could destroy Chopin very easily.
I can destroy Chopin very easily.
I can destroy it more. But like this music, you can play it on a MIDI keyboard, and it has much of its value still baked in.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so maybe we shift gears a bit and go to a composer. We say he's as great as Bach. It's like Bach, but missing a chromosome. Maybe he has a different, extra, like more curious one.
And actually Bach admired him a lot. So Telemann lived primarily in Magdeburg, which is also where my husband is from. So I'm very happy about that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, nice connection with Telemann there.
Is there a big statue of Telemann in this town, in the town square?
My husband had never heard of Telemann, so I'm not sure. But when I go there, I will let you know. So Bach and Telemann were friends. Bach admired Telemann a lot, his writing. And Telemann wrote these 12 fantasies for Violin ohne Bass, so violin without bass. We can't really say it's unaccompanied, just like solo Bach, you're accompanying yourself. The accompaniment is baked into the music. But I chose this movement because probably fewer people are familiar with it, and it's nice to apply tools to brand new music so that you're not shouldered with any expectations or kind of habits, let's say. So again, I've done a few random squiggles, what look like random squiggles. And right at the beginning, we notice that, okay, check out this bass line. Now this reminds me of two things. The first thing is sort of a lament bass, right? Like Bieber, Passacaglia, or Dido's Lament, or anything like that. Very, very popular in Baroque times. The other thing it reminds me of is just a chaconne, like a repeating bass line, which Passacaglia has that as well. But I could imagine it like... and just continuing
the Renaissance
on and on.
fair is that way.
Oh, I've missed it. I'm sorry. Oh.
You're not dressed for it right
I'm
now.
not dressed for it. But right away, these connotations come to mind, and that's going to shape how I respond with the melody in the upper voice. Now something new. Now that I can feel intuitively that there's some kind of really, unhappy dissonance on the third one, right?
What if you do the opposite? Blasphemous. Go away from the D major.
Okay, well, let's not call it blasphemous. Don't knock until you try it, Daniel. Be open-minded.
It doesn't work when you do that, but I think it could work with the upper voice. Mm-hmm. It's like the upper voice ends.
That works. Yeah, beautiful. Sure. Anyway, exploring these relationships and question your own intuition, because it's not going to be the only beautiful interpretation. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, but there is some relation between those bass notes.
Oh yeah.
There is some story, and we have to find the story, and that's gonna guide us. Okay, now we get to a surprise. This is very bare. I'm so sad, right? There's no bass. It's just G minor, just in the top. No, I'm here to save you. So the fact that this C starting in measure 13 is just there, right? That's kind of our pedal. It's like our comforting pedal. And I'm listening. Oh, thank you. That's going to sound better.
Is there a B flat there as well somewhere?
Well, depends. It might be a B flat, or it might be that. Yeah. Right, and that will change how you color this chord, because look at this. I've written 6-5 exclamation point. That's not a fingering. I don't have 6 fingers, but it's right. It's the 6th and the 5th and the 3rd above the sounding bass, which is very unstable chord. Very unstable chord. And see the big circle here. The pink circle, the pink rock. That's because there's no bass. And now again.
How would a lute play that? Do you think a lute would fill this in, or is it legit to also not fill it in. Like you could probably
You
just
totally
add
could
chords
add- you
everywhere,
could.
but like, is it kind of interesting to not?
It might be interesting. Let's see.
Because he could have put it in. I mean, we could do it as violinists as well.
I might, being an expert lute player myself, I'm being sarcastic, I don't play lute. I might leave that open.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I agree with you. Since he.
So then, how do you get from to the next one?
Mm-hmm.
It goes from using the C to the B flat, right? Because this, or kind of, if there's no some sort of stepwise motion there, like.
Yeah, it's kind of isolate those chords.
See, Bach would never do that.
And again, notice your facial expressions, right? Like, can you be my guinea pig?
Oh no,
So,
I'm not good at it.
well, just be natural. Like, what do your eyebrows want to do if I play? And now, yeah, okay, interesting.
Whoa.
Yeah.
And then give me a.
Now here, beautiful surprise. Look at this. Naked F. No third, no fifth, no octave, nothing. Just a little F. Is it the end of a phrase? Is it the start of a phrase? This is where I wrote F. Small f meaning F minor, but question mark, question mark, question mark. Possible elision. Lots of different ways that you can interpret it and perform it.
But like here, I would definitely leave it bare. And a good lute player, I think, would also leave it.
Yes.
Because you don't want to establish F major and then destroy it in the next beat necessarily.
Yes.
You want a kind of an ambiguity.
You're right. That's a great point. Yeah. Like leaving it, how would you play an F if you're trying to convey minor versus major? How does your timbre change? But there's still the additional question of where you want to start the phrase. So do you want to... Do you want to start it from there, or do you want to... Or... So... But thinking about it from this perspective opens up those different possibilities. That's really the biggest point.
Yeah.
Okay, so then continuing on, kind of similar ideas you'll see, and the arrows and the melodic fluency, all of this is giving you cues. The green parts that I've highlighted in the score are cadential moments. And you can be convincing or not convincing with those. As you want. I'll finish with the end. Do we have time for the very end?
Yeah, we also just have a question. Maybe you
sure.
can tie the end into kind of what.
Yeah.
We have a question about what changes occur when you play on a Baroque violin.
Oh, interesting.
So.
Let's give it a try and see.
Changeo, presto, changeo.
Presto, changeo. Just went to the workshop and exchanged my modern violin for a
Do you know
Berlin.
Do you know this Charlie Chaplin film, Limelight?
No.
No. So he plays. There's a scene where he's a violinist, and it's like one of the funniest scenes ever. He's like tuning with the piano on stage, and it's just all this funny drama. And his violin ends up breaking on stage, and the pianist breaks it. It's so funny. And then he like pulls another one out and like starts playing. And I feel like.
Millionaire.
That's what you just did. Like, pull out the Baroque violin.
Well, that's a great question, and I'm happy you asked, because a lot of my approach comes from my own explorations with Baroque equipment and ideas. Not trying to sound exactly like something or do something for the sake of following rules. But one very noticeable thing that happens is how the bow interacts with the gut string and how the bow sounds on down versus up. So unlike the modern bow, the Baroque bow is made to sound more like the human voice and like breathing. So we're breathing out for the down bow. Okay, so down bow is breathing out, and up bow is more like breathing in, as a kind of general guideline. Yeah, does that answer the question?
Yeah. I mean, there's so much, of course, to say.
A quick answer, but.
But yeah, maybe let's just continue a bit. And
sure, I'll switch back. To modern, just for people's pitch customization. Is probably more modern violinists watching this than Baroque violinists, but I encourage you to try both if you haven't. Okay, so yeah, just a little bit about the ending. We have this kind of little coda. I'll start from, where's a good place to start? How about where we think the cadence could be? So this is measure 35. Piece could end there, but he keeps going. Okay, B flat. Oh, E flat. Oh my gosh, roller coaster. No, B flat. And then we finally get mum, pum, pum. And if you just sing it, you'll feel that is leading towards the final home tonic.
I'm curious, what do you find are the kind of defining qualities of Telemann's music versus Bach? It's kind of the same question as like Haydn versus Mozart. Like there's...
I would say sometimes the evidence of the labor behind the craft is a little bit more obvious, right? Sometimes with Bach, the craftsmanship is just so seemingly effortless, and sometimes with Telemann you can see a little bit of the scaffolding, and you can see a little bit behind the process, which is amazing. I love the music for that reason. The other thing I find about Telemann is that they're as difficult as like chordal Bach playing is, especially in fugues and stuff like that. The chords in Telemann can surprisingly be a little bit more awkward.
Do you find that one of them is more in touch with, let's say, folk influence or dance influence? Like I feel like Bach, to the degree that he was playing with these Baroque dances as inspiration, like it was almost an exercise sometimes in like using some form and some style just as a conduit to express. Whereas I think maybe with Telemann it was a little more I don't want to say authentic, but I also don't want to say provincial, but somehow more in touch with sort of like Baroque dance or like folk forms. I don't know.
With Bach.
With Telemann.
Yeah.
Because it's less crafted in a certain way than Bach.
Right.
And like less perfected. Like if you go the next step and go to like, you know, early Baroque, late Renaissance, and the kind of more human music rather than more godly music. Yeah,
I was going to say one thing that, I mean, I certainly associate Bach more with sacred music and Telemann more with chamber music.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, yeah.
So, because Bach we don't really think of as a chamber music composer. He did write some, but...
Like, I listen to this and I think, oh yeah, like I could have written that. Like, obviously I couldn't have. But I never get that feeling with Bach. Like I could.
Interesting.
I don't know where that came from.
Yeah. So maybe that's kind of speaking to my point about like the craft being a little bit more.
Yeah.
Like the scaffolding is a little bit more.
And there's something so charming and enjoyable to play about that.
Yes. I agree. And it's with these 12 fantasies, you know, there are brilliant recordings out there and wonderful performances, but they're not as often played as solo Bach. So if you want to work on this specific, you know, Austro-German polyphonic chordal type of technique, and you don't want to play Bach, then Telemann is a great place to go in between, or to start with, or to return to. Lots of wonderful music in there.
Yeah. And maybe just to close out, I'm going to circle back to this idea of music theory and the bridge, and kind of building a bridge between music theory and practice and performance. Mm-hmm. What can we do in music schools to kind of encourage that? Like, what changes would you like to see to the curriculum, or just maybe in your own experience in school, like what you thought was missing that could, like, obviously your private teachers, so much of, will make or break that in the studies, but is there something more structural in the school system that can bridge that divide?
I think that, good theory teachers are inherently really good musicians, and so maybe if you feel that your own textbook curriculum is limiting, then you can have the confidence to just show up with your instrument, right? Or have people bring their instruments to class more. I think people are really used to just always leaving their instruments in the locker, or it's out of sight, out of mind, and having that really tactile connection, I think is quite illuminating. I mean, my own theory background, I was really lucky because when I did study it at Juilliard, one of my great mentors in my professional life, Steve Lates, he wrote a wonderful book called The Complete Musician, which is aiming at what it sounds like. So kind of this approach to theory that is much more complete and much more aimed at true musicianship. So I'm not aiming to resolve any systemic problems or point them out. And you'll also notice that today I actually used very few specific theoretical terms, and that was quite intentional. I didn't want to present, some kind of like blocky, intimidating analysis, because that's another thing to remember, is that as performers, as people involved with our craft, we have the creativity and the license to use these theoretical tools how they are best going to serve us. So if you want to call it something different, that's fine. If you want to, mark it differently, that's fine.
Yeah, and what you said about having the instrument, I mean, I can't remember how many music theory classes in school where there were actually instruments out. Like, very few of those classes were any. And I'm just imagining, like, learning all of those concepts with the instrument, with a piece of music, like playing, trying things, bouncing things back and forth, and like, I feel like a lot of music theory is then felt more intuitively. I think it's like that with any topic. There's this way of learning that's like teaching the test, and then there's this way of learning where you understand fundamental concepts, and then you can quickly understand so many of the details from first principles. And it's like in math, you have this, like, people that are good at math, or in like the foundational understanding, like, it's not a question of memorizing formulas. They can intuit all sorts of things from a foundation that is felt.
I completely agree. So I think students these days have so much pressure to perform well on tests, to perform well in these kind of very quantitative ways, and remembering that the crank turning is really quite absent from the most meaningful approach to this, in my opinion, and giving yourself the room to feel perhaps a little bit uncomfortable and have a little bit of an uncertainty and have more exploration. I think ultimately that's much more rewarding, and you're going to have a more interesting time interacting with the music that way.
Lovely. All right. Well, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you very much, Julia, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's nice to do these live and not through Zoom when possible. And yeah, I hope you all check out the TONEBASE platform if you haven't yet. There's some really cool new videos. We just released Ilya Gringold's teaching the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, so that's a fun one. And I'm not going to reveal some other things in the pipeline, but I think there's there's some fun stuff.
See, you're thwarting expectations.
I'm gonna thwart the expectations, and I hope you'll come back at some point,
Thank you so much.
we can do this again.
Yeah.
That was very illuminating.
Thank
So
you.
wish you all a good day, and see you next time.
Bye.